Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome wherever you may be in the world, in your homes or listening in your cars. I am thrilled to welcome all of you to today's event, Philip Roth Reconsidered. My name is Shana Hammerman. I'm the Associate Director at the Tobey Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford. Speaking of which, we have a semi-weekly newsletter. So if you'd like to receive the newsletter, please send me an email address in the chat and I will add you to our list. I also want to thank Stanford's History Department for co-sponsoring this event today. Our panelists will be in conversation for the first portion of the event, after which we will open it up for Q&A with you, our many attendees. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom windows to pose your questions. You can type in a question at any time during the event, and we will do our best to respond to each of you during the Q&A time. It is an honor for me to introduce our panelists today as some of the foremost experts on Roth in the world. First, we have Amy Posorsky, who is the co-editor of the journal Philip Roth Studies. Amy is professor of English at Central Connecticut State University, where she directs the English graduate program. She is the author of Roth and Trauma, The Problem of History in the Later Works from 2011. Failing After 9/11, Crisis in American Art and Literature from 2014, and several other edited volumes on Roth and other subjects in contemporary American literature, trauma theory, and narrative medicine. Jesse Tisch has published widely on Roth in Tablet, Jewish Review of Books, and elsewhere. His essays on Roth, as well as Mel Brooks, Ben Hecht, Gertrude Stein, Leonard Michaels, have elicited considerable attention. Until 2012, Jesse was director of the Posen Foundation in the US, and before then he worked as a journalist covering sports, crime, and live events in Maine. Last but certainly not least, Stephen J. Zipperstein is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish Culture and History at Stanford. His most recent book is Pogrom, Kishinev, and the Tilt of History from 2018, and he is currently writing a biography of Roth for Yale's Jewish Lives series. So thank you all, and Steve, I turn it over to you.
Shana, thank you very much. When one thinks about novels devoted to intellectual and academic life, by and large, they portray jealousy, enmity, obsessive possessiveness. Contrary to these portrayals, the three of us have been talking with a great deal of profit and amicability and friendliness about Philip Roth now for the last several months, though we've never met in the flesh. But of course, few of us have seen anyone in the flesh aside from our loved ones for as long as I can remember. And so the idea we came up with is really a very simple one. We would speak for no more than 7 to 10 minutes about how each of us came to Roth and why this preoccupation with Roth has persisted. And after we give our individual presentations, we'll talk among ourselves and demonstrate that I'm correct in my assertion that intellectuals and academics are able to speak with one another in an amicable way. And then we'll open up for discussion. And without further ado, I turn to Amy. We're going in alphabetical order, and I was blessed and cursed with the name Zipperstein, and so consequently, I go now as often last. Amy.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you very much for the generous introduction, Shana, and to Stephen for bringing us all together. Thank you to Jesse for being here with us, and to Iva Clem, who organized things behind the scenes. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. The topic of this discussion is Roth Reconsidered. And while planning my remarks for today, I continue to come back to this question. Roth Reconsidered, considered again or anew? In light of what? Surely the appearance of 2 biographies of Roth this year, one authorized, the other not authorized, has changed the landscape of Roth studies this past spring. And thanks to Stephen, there will be more work to come that allows us to survey Roth's life in light of his works, or more appropriately, perhaps, to survey Roth's works in light of his life. But there is another context in which we may want to reconsider Roth, and that is in light of the Metoo movement and the Black Lives Matter movement that may at first glance demand that we think about Roth differently, especially in terms of his representations of women and people of color. This semester, when teaching Roth, a common practice since 2003, students for the first time suggested that Roth's work may not stand up to the kind of scrutiny we 21st century readers demand of our literary works. Of course, everyone here can probably agree that Roth is one of the finest writers of the 20th and 21st centuries. His style is unparalleled. But do we need to reconsider Roth in terms of his political, gendered, and racialized content? Do we want to? As one guest, Jack Berliner-Blau, who has a book coming out as well on Roth and his legacy, asked my students when visiting via Zoom for a lecture this spring, is Roth going to be canceled? That, of course, was meant to be a tantalizing question that literally comes from the headlines of the British press. But it now has us all thinking about Roth's legacy in the long term. In order to answer these questions framed by our topic, Roth Reconsidered, I want now to turn to the assignment I have been given by Professor Zipperstein. You looked a little nervous, Stephen, like I wasn't going to get to the question.
I always, this is my general look.
So I will get to the assignment to discuss here this afternoon what led me to Roth in the first place. I came to Roth as a scholar first, having landed with the theory folks at Emory University in 1998. While my creative writing professors in the 1990s assigned regularly the ghostwriter from 1979, in order to underline the painful realities of the life of the writer, it was not until I picked up The Dying Animal that I understood how to put my newfound theoretical knowledge to work. While most people I knew were talking about Roth in terms of how he represents the experience of Jewish American men navigating the US post-World War II, with a laser focus on his alter egos, Nathan Zuckerman and David Kopesh, and yes, even Portnoy to an extent, which we'll hear about soon, I was interested in how he represented such vulnerable figures as children and ailing young women caught adrift in a changing America. It was Consuela Castillo, the woman dying of cancer, dating her older professor in The Dying Animal, that spoke to me against the backdrop of the turn into the new century from 1999 to 2000, the moment Roth called the mockery of Armageddon, because we all braced ourselves for an end of the world moment. Remember Y2K, bank accounts, water bottles. The end never came, an end we prepared for in order to heal the wounds from previous global atrocities that took us by surprise. In addition to Consuela, there are many examples, often overlooked, of vulnerable women and children in Roth's work. So many that I once argued that we reconsider Roth the way we reconsider Henry James. And Jesse makes these great comparisons in his work between the early Roth and Henry James, reconsidering them both not as a grand titan of American letters who hope to uphold the status quo, but as champions of the underdog, the forgotten and unaccounted for. The earliest example appears in Goodbye Columbus and Other Stories, when Roth takes up the theme of displaced orphans in the wake of the Holocaust. That's from Eli the Fanatic. His next work, Letting Go, from 1962, a Henry Jamesian tome, I guess, features many apparently disjointed scenes involving a vulnerable child. In a section entitled Children and Men, for example, a young boy named Marky falls to his death while sleeping on the top bunk. It seems like a totally gratuitous scene taken out of context. So there's the struggling, surviving single mother, Martha, in Letting Go, the troubled college girl, Olivia, in Indignation, the malaprop riddled, also terminally ill, Drinka Balich in Sabbath Theater, the aged and terminally ill Amy Billette in Exit Ghost. In Nemesis, Roth takes on the lunatic cruelty, that's a quote from Nemesis, of deaths of children during the polio crisis in 1944. Bucky Cantor calls these polio-inflicted deaths, quote, a war of slaughter, ruin, waste, and damnation, war with the ravages of war upon the children of Newark. There are two children of Fania Farley who die in a fire in the human stain. And then there is Fania herself. And I want to pause a bit here on Fania. My memory of learning about Roth's real-life lover who inspired Fania is a little fuzzy, although her connection to Roth has now been treated to a greater or lesser extent in both the Nadal and Bailey biographies. In my memory, it is the third week in July of 2011, and I have just finished my work for the day in the Connecticut farmhouse of Philip Roth. On this day, Roth tells me a story of a beautiful woman who shares characteristics with his imagined Fania, whose children burn in a fire possibly started by her partner, Les. This is in the novel. A Vietnam veteran with post-traumatic stress disorder. I thought at the time that Roth started telling me the story of Fania and her inspiration because we had discussed earlier Freud's dream of the burning child, one of his famous illustrations of trauma's aftermath. However, it was the character built from one woman's scrappy suffering and failed despair that had been on Roth's mind. Did her children die in real life? I asked. No, he answers. She did. And then silence. I try to match the image of the woman from Roth's memory with the way she is relayed in the novel. The purpose of this exposed memory on the summer day is to bear witness to her suffering. One day he tried to save her life, guaranteeing that she received the medical care she needed. When he walked into her hospital room, she shouted at him. It seemed to be the last picture he had of her. She wanted to die. There are a couple of F words in there, which I will not repeat, and he had forced her to live. Roth's story, the story about a woman he knew, a woman he cared about and provided for, helped me revise my earlier understanding of the place of trauma in Roth's work. From then on, it became more connected with the significance of the ethical witness in the face of a vulnerable person's suffering, and less about how an everyman navigates historical and global traumas of the 20th and 21st centuries. From the beginning to end of Roth's fiction, he takes up this question of children and responsibility, of an impossible ethics in the face of grief. And that gets us back to Fania. When I return to the human stain, I think about the racial trauma behind Fania's, behind Coleman Silk's life-altering decision to pass. And I think about Les Farley's post-traumatic stress disorder in the wake of Vietnam. But we must not forget Fania Farley, the mistress of Coleman Silk, and the hapless 34-year-old who died a, quote, gruesome death, unquote. Her funeral is narrated over 6 pages toward the end of The Human Stain. What does a Midwestern woman, a lapsed Catholic whose parents didn't attend college, see in Roth's works? Honestly, I see myself. In all of those women dating older professors, smile, in the women who feel wedged into some idealized version of womanhood, or more importantly, who push their way out. But I don't think so. I'm sorry, maybe I am making excuses for an author and a man I admire so much, but I don't think so. In reconsidering Roth, I think we need to remember all of the voices he gave to silenced people, children who die without a witness, and women who are demeaned because they don't fit. Thank you.
Thank you. Later, you might share with us some of your personal reminiscences about older professors. Jesse, please.
Okay, that was wonderful, Amy. I kind of envy Steve's Z name since you're a tough act to follow, but I'll try. So answering Steve's prompt, how did I become fascinated with Roth? Like any good Jewish boy, I blame my mother, who inexplicably handed me Portnoy's complaint in high school. That was the gateway drug, leading to harder stuff. But first, came Portnoy. The humor, the wildness, the sheer chutzpah of Roth's scream of consciousness was, to me, a revelation. I thought, this is allowed? You can do this? What else has this Roth guy written? Eventually, I made a shift from reader to amateur Rothologist. What I discovered, poking around Roth's archives, was a complex, sensitive, endlessly provocable person, deeply reactive. An example, in London restaurants, Roth sometimes noticed people whispering Jew as if it were offensive. From then on, when someone whispered Jew, Roth would curse loudly enough to silence his company. They felt ashamed, here's another serving. They thought Jew was an obscenity, here's a real obscenity. In short, Roth was my kind of guy, my kind of Jew. Brilliant, excessive, prickly, defiant. Jews with appetite, Jews without shame, Roth writes in Deception. Complaining Jews, brash Jews, unaccommodating Jews, full of anger, insult, and argument. That passage, Roth describing Jews, Roth describing Roth, is also a fine example of Roth's formidable voice. It's that singular voice, insistent, confiding, compelling, and above all, intimate. Roth's writing, whatever else it is personal. He's almost never detached. He has skin in the game. In fact, he has skin all over the place. He's often vexed, indignant, and eclectic in his dislikes. If there's one thing that can be said unequivocally about Roth, it's that his brain is not a quiet place. It's a busy, clamorous place with cymbals clanging and pistons pumping. It can be dark in there. I picture bats. Researching Roth means confronting this darker side, his narcissism, his paranoia, his occasional misogyny. All are real, if sometimes overstated. But Roth's detractors, and at times I've been one, tend to miss a lot. With friends, Roth was exceedingly generous, and his support of European writers was both courageous and selfless. Selflessness, not something we normally ascribe to Roth, the great anatomist of selves, namely his own. Yet the record is clear. For years, Roth quietly supported embattled Czech writers, funneling money through back channels. Roth gave his best to others and brought out the best in others, which is one definition of Menschlichkeit. His writing contains whole worlds, from literature to fame to friendship to the everyday pleasures of swimming and walking in the country. That said, Roth has his pet obsessions, like all writers. In a sense, much of Roth's fiction addresses two questions: who am I and how can I survive? His novels teem with callous critics, cunning ex-wives, crafty biographers. You can practically hear them sharpening their knives. Not to mention more passive enemies who haunted Roth: stingy publishers, selfish friends, the Nobel Committee. It's a jungle out there. Who can you really trust? Not even yourself, apparently. After all, what's worse than the loneliness you inflict on yourself? Your harsh, restless conscience, your fragile body always betraying you. Your greatest enemy, it would seem, isn't the Philistines at the New York Times Book Review. It's yourself, your own intensity and frailty, your own self-sabotaging instincts, which undermine your stronger, saner self. How do you defend against that? Roth can sound hysterical and self-pitying at times, and it's easy to snicker at that aspect of his work. But if he makes us uncomfortable, perhaps it's because we secretly identify with him. After all, the world can seem, and indeed is, indifferent to our flourishing, and only a few saintly humans never disappoint us. Roth, our laureate of victimhood, is wonderfully attuned to the inimical nature of the world, how frequently it disappoints, thwarting our deepest desires. Roth's outstanding quality is his energy, that great life force, but his defining quality is his dividedness. We can speak of Roth's plural, since he was split 50 different ways. It can seem that Roth possesses two very different orientations toward the truth. In his fiction, he's brutally honest, especially about himself. In real life, he was a dissembler, a trickster. Here, you can think of Dylan, Warhol, and other great self-concealers and self-dramatizers. His interviews, his letters, the stories he told friends, Roth simply can't be trusted about himself, which makes him both a fascinating but also a dangerous subject for biographers. If I sound certain in these pronouncements, let me admit something. Having researched Roth, having pondered Roth for years, I'll confess that he remains a mystery to me. Looking at Roth as a biographer would, examining his formation and transformations, I'm often baffled. What childhood trauma produced such towering range? What explains his control mania, his need to perform, his overpowering need for self-expression? The search for causes and etiologies can seem endless. Likewise, it can be hard to see Roth clearly. His fame, his powerful charm, even his handsomeness all cloud our vision. In the spirit of Rothian excess, one final point. The heyday of Jewish American writers is long past, and white male voices are happily ignored these days. Yet in a curious way, this may be Roth's moment. Roth distrusted ideology, the various isms that pass for knowledge, and political correctness. He had plenty to say about purity tests and how politics has a way of making smart people say very dumb things. Roth's religion was literature, and as we know, literature dwells in uncertainty and ambiguity. At a moment when politics subsumes everything, he reminds us that no one is pure or should pretend to be. Better to admit one's human failings, including ignorance and confusion. In humble moments, Roth enjoyed admitting his own confusion. He is eloquent on the point. We're always getting things and people wrong. It's how we know we're alive, he says, we're wrong. Yet it's also true, and it was certainly true of Roth, that we're compelled to get things right. And so Roth, elusive, protean, endlessly complex, remains an irresistible, fascinating figure, one who, as I said, still speaks to us and speaks to me. I think of him like Freud, bringing bad news, puncturing illusions. Like Kafka, he riles us, shattering the frozen sea within, which may be the highest calling of any artist, regardless of medium.
Well, I picture bats. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to begin with some personal reflections that I've shared once or twice before. Hopefully this won't seem redundant, and then I'll make some more general remarks about my preoccupation with Roth. When I was very young, 6, 7, 8, I'm not quite sure, growing up as an Orthodox Jew in Los Angeles, neighbors around the corner, for reasons that I can't quite reconstruct, gave me a rather large, chubby Buddha, and as a gift. And I remember carrying it around the corner, terrified, because of course I knew about the story of Abraham and its midrashic, its Jewish literary allusions, and the way in which Abraham was preoccupied with shattering idols. I was carrying an idol around the corner to my home. I came home. I sat down with my sister, 2 years younger. We deliberated and decided the best place for the idol was under a tree, and we buried it under a tree. A few years later, my father leveled the tree, not himself. No one in our neighborhood ever leveled trees by themselves, and built a massive library over it, numbering some 30,000 books. And I sometimes would think, especially once I started reading Roth in the various magazines in the late 60s, not in the 50s, actually, about how I was reading Roth while sitting just literally over that Buddha, deep underneath. Everything in the home that I grew up in was really built around books. And books, my father amassed a library of tens of thousands of books. We used to go together to the cavern-like bookstores that then existed in Los Angeles and Long Beach, even in Hollywood. I think there was World of Books off of Hollywood Boulevard, as if Los Angeles itself was a world of books. And my father bought by the pound, and there was a great deal of dross and some real treasures. And at first, books brought us together, and then eventually, as I moved from Eugene O'Neill to Bertrand Russell, and then to Marx and Roth, it was books that tore us apart. Even our arguments were bookish. I remember my father entering with enormous anger the first apartment that I shared with a girl. We were in our late teens. I was a boy. She was a girl, and he looked at the wall just beside him as he entered the door, and there was a poster of Mikhail Bakunin, the anarchist. And my father's first comment as he entered our apartment, furious, I was soon disowned, was, now Bakunin, that's worse than Marx. These were the sorts of arguments that we had, and it was in the midst of this sort of environment that I came to Roth. Roth managed, when I first read him in the New American Review, Partisan Review, and elsewhere, where he was publishing slices of Portnoy's Complaint. I read Goodbye Columbus only later. Roth managed, even in the late 60s, to write about sexuality in a shocking way, which itself is absolutely shocking. And I mean, in the wake of Woodstock, of Janis Joplin, of Leonard Cohen, apparently sleeping with essentially everyone until, before his turn to Buddhism, what Roth was able to identify was that one truly shameful act that was associated with sexuality, namely that loathly act that in many ways has characterized presumably adolescence forever, and to write about it and in a way that actually shocked readers. It's shocking that at that moment sexuality would shock. I remember the first course I took out of yeshiva when I left the Chicago yeshiva in the fall of 1969. I was in UCLA in a large lecture hall, Moore Hall 100. It held several hundred people. As a studious student, I sat up front. It was a psychology class taught by a teacher a man who resembled Chris Christopherson on his better days. And I remember sitting there at the end of class when women after class offered themselves to him. And this was a long, long way from the Chicago yeshiva. In the midst of this kind of atmosphere, Roth was able to actually write something truly shocking. One of the most shocking features of Portnoy's complaint, it seems to me, and one rarely or too rarely commented on, is not so much what he writes about Jews, but he writes about what he writes about non-Jews. Just one passage: when duty, discipline, and obedience give way, here is the message I take each Passover with my mother's matzah brai. What follows, there is no predicting, renunciation is all. Cries, the kosher and bloodless piece of steak my father and I sit down to eat at dinner time. Self-control, sobriety, sanctions. This is the key to human life, saith all those endless dietary laws. Let the goyim seek their teeth into whatever lowly creature crawls and grunts across the face of the dirty earth. We will not contaminate our humanity thus. Let them, you know who I mean, gorge themselves upon anything and everything that moves, no matter how odious and abject the animal, no matter how grotesque or schmutzig or dumb the creature in question happens to be. Let them eat eels and frogs and pigs and crabs and lobsters. Let them eat vulture. Let them eat ape meat and skunk if they like. They will eat anything they can get into their big goy hands. And the terrifying is that they'll do anything as well. Deer eat what deer eat, and what Jews eat, but not these goyim, crawling animals. Yes, all is written down in history, what they have done, our illustrious neighbors who own the world and know absolutely nothing of human boundaries and limits. His portrait of a lonely hysteric is extraordinary, and his portrait of rage is extraordinary. What stayed with me over the years with regard to Roth is first of all his capacity to write deeply, brilliantly about Jews and the world at the same time, without actually scanting one or the other, without any semblance of Jewishness being something parochial, and never arguing with the notion that Jewishness is parochial, although he always insisted, as did Bellow and Malamud and others, that he wasn't an American Jewish writer. It seems to me that one definition of an American Jewish writer of that generation is someone who insists, usually that he is not an American Jewish writer. And so he was able to embrace the world and Jewishness at the same time. He was able to embrace high culture and low culture at the same time, and to treat both with equal seriousness and passion and intelligence. And he, as Jesse just indicated, he was always able, though as a person perhaps not, but as a writer with great consistency, able to question himself, able to raise serious questions about himself, insistent on giving, as often as not, the most persuasive, best voice, as he does in the anatomy lesson, to the person who's arguing with the Zuckerman character, not to Zuckerman himself. I think the most potent example of this, in my mind, is the way in which he ends that rather facile memoir that he calls The Facts, with Zuckerman arguing about many things, including perhaps one of the most sensitive and unresolved features of Roth's work, the way in which his mother permeates all of Roth's work and yet is an all but invisible character. As Zuckerman, there's this marvelous epilogue for those of you who haven't read it. He finishes this memoir of his earliest years, and then he has his character Zuckerman respond and criticize the memoir. And in one paragraph, he writes, "Comfort yourself, if you like, son, embittered permanently by his deprivation. Take solace in that, if you like. But the fact remains, I'm not a fool, and I don't believe you. Look, this place you come from does not produce artists so much as it produces dentists and accountants. I'm convinced that there is something in the romance of your childhood that you're not permitting yourself to talk about, though without it, the rest of the book makes no sense. I just cannot trust you as a memoirist the way I trust you as a novelist, because as I've said, to tell you what you tell best is forbidden to you by a decorous, citizenly, filial conscience. With this book, you tied your hands behind your back and tried to write it with your toes. And above all, it's his scanting of his mother that stands out as one of the prime criticisms in this epilogue. It's as I've said in previous talks, in the end, it's Roth's sentences that one remembers, not so much the stories. The stories themselves are in some ways forgettable, which I think is one of the reasons why the film versions of Roth are by and large mediocre, with the rarest of exceptions. Roth argues with rage, with anger. Interestingly, one of the other great American writers whose work is characterized by rage, and in some ways little else, is John Steinbeck. And he argues with rage consistently, and with rage in many ways directed at himself, raising enormously vexing questions about himself. And I think for this reason, among many others, he is likely to remain a fertile, disturbing, crucial voice in our culture. So let's talk among ourselves for a few minutes.
I have a question that brings together Stephen's work and Jesse's, and I kind of selfishly want to put the two in conversation now that I have both of you in front of me, and it has to do with this idea of rage. So the thing that brought me to Stephen's work is the uncovering of the famous tape from Yeshiva University, in which it seems on multiple listens that people really liked him. And I was thinking about Stephen's work there with regard to Jesse's argument that Roth is not happy unless he has something to fight against, to rail against. And so I'm wondering if those two things work together. Did Roth have to make up this story about the yeshiva conference in order to have something to fuel his future work? Why would he do that? Misremember it that way, I guess, is what I'm asking in part.
Yeah, I think the question has to do with the word happy, which in some ways may be a synonym of the word nice, which may be an antonym with regard to Philip Roth. And not that he couldn't be nice, as Jesse said, he could be enormously generous. He really, with regard to East Central European writers, he essentially ran an entire publishing house, soliciting the forewords, negotiating with a printer, doing all those sorts of things with regard to writers who at the time were by and large obscure and penniless, and sending them money. But literature is not about what's nice. And as he writes, as Jesse has reminded us several times in our conversations, about people in trouble, Otherwise, people don't really interest him on the page. And now Roth himself, and this is one of the problems likely faced by a biographer like myself, Roth himself could be obstinate, unforgiving, and obsessive, and absolutely sure of himself. Roth on the page is constantly questioning the narrator's voice. The writer on the page is not necessarily the same as the man or woman who is doing the writing. We know that time and time again. We don't need to be reminded of that by Roth. So it is true that Roth left that Yeshiva University gathering at 62, as I came to learn when I discovered the tape, absolutely sure that he was being treated like Salman Rushdie, and in fact, in some ways, he was being honored in ways akin to Martin Buber, and that he didn't want to feel. What he heard, and these voices were the critical voices. And that's all he heard, and that's all he remembered. And fortunately for us as his readers, he was able to turn that into literary gold.
I think that gets to the heart of things. We know that anger was very useful to Roth. I mean, anger was rocket fuel. And in a kind of paradoxical way, I think it soothed him. When Roth was angry, he very much knew who he was. And maybe on some fundamental ontological level, it solved that question that's always nagging him. You know, who am I? That question subsides when he sits down in a fury. As for the yeshiva event, to me, the interesting question for a biographer is, by what psychological process does a welcome reception turn into the Spanish Inquisition? How does that happen? Maybe you have some insight into that, Steve.
Well, I mean, Emanuel Rachman, the great, actually liberal Orthodox rabbi, did criticize him. He was criticized from pulpits, and he was told about that. He received angry letters, but he received a multitude of complimentary letters. And Roth is not the only writer who only remembers criticism. This may be a shortcoming at one moment or another of one of the three of us, and
it's you, Amy.
Personally, I'm sure that's not true of either of you, and so that in and of itself isn't peculiar, and the fact that Roth was by some measure, perhaps in a profound measure, peculiar is not in and of itself peculiar. There's something simply strange about the lives that even the three of us have chosen to lead. To the extent to which I know the other two of you, we spend almost all of our times. I live in Berkeley. The sun is shining. I've been in this study for the last 8 to 10 hours. I've been reading in preparation for 7 to 10 minutes of remarks that I was going to make that basically were practiced already. I'm going to be sitting in this study for the next 3, 4, 5 months until I start teaching again. I'm turning sentences over time and time again. There's something not normal about that, and yet that is my life, and I can't imagine doing it any other way. I remember Roth turning to me during one of our conversations and saying, you were sitting in his apartment on 79th Street, and he says, Central Park is down the street. It's one of the most beautiful spots in the world. Why can't I spend time there? And I'm sure all of us, in one way or another, have made similar choices from the vantage point of many others, bizarre choices. But those are the sorts of choices that one makes. I think a key to Roth in many ways, let me, to the extent to which I've been able to move toward the construction of the biography that I'm writing, is his preoccupation with mother, a topic that I think was so astonishingly difficult to write about. He couldn't. He could barely write about. One story that was told to me by Barbara Sproul, who was a friend of his, a lover for longer than most. She told about how Mrs. Roth was visiting them in Connecticut, and apparently had never seen or never taken in the existence of a dishwasher. And after dinner, Barbara was putting the dishes in the dishwasher, and Mrs. Roth watched her with some degree of amazement. And Barbara then heard noises in the kitchen at 3 a.m. And when she went down to the kitchen, Philip's mother was carefully taking each dish out of the dishwasher, each dish that had been cleaned in the dishwasher, and washing it again. And so this man who writes about the crucial importance of schmutz, how it's crucial to actually recognize that all of literature is about schmutz, not only the story of Epstein, but everything else is mothered by this mother. There has to be some connection between one and the other, and the way in which he emerges from a room where he's by and large celebrated, and all he hears is schmutz.
The mother as killer of schmutz, that sounds a lot like Sophie Portnoy to me. What do you think about the representation in Portnoy's complaint?
Well, I mean, I was told by Sandy's last wife that though Philip resisted, they actually denied that his mother ever actually held a knife over them and insisting that they eat, that his mother indeed held a knife over them and insisted that they eat. There's no one-to-one relationship between literature and life. There is often an intimate relationship between literature and life. I'm sure I'm not saying anything that isn't said in an English 101 class in that respect. Do you have anything to ask of Amy?
We were touching on Roth's sentence, or Roth's voice and Roth's style, which is so singularly his. You were saying, Steve, that there was, you were wondering why America was so eminently shockable in the late 1960s. After all, there's a long history of shocking writing and confessional writing, going from Mary McCarthy to the confessional poets to Montaigne to de Sade back to St. Augustine. Roth isn't saying anything that de Sade hasn't said, but he's saying things differently, and that's sometimes a matter of style. He's not a graceful writer like Cynthia Ozick, but he's a forceful writer. So maybe, Amy, you could say, you've written about Roth's prosody. Maybe say something about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, in part, and speaking of confessional moments, I studied contemporary American poetry. I was trained as a poetry critic. And when I saw this job opening at Central Connecticut State, I applied for a job teaching contemporary American novels. And so now I'm thinking, where do I fit? What do I do? But it is in fact true that you can read any Rothian sentence as a piece of poetry. I mean, I think you used the word prosody. I mean, rhythm, sound, repetition, punctuation, internal rhyme. Stephen, that passage that you read from Portnoy's complaint, let them eat, let them eat, let them eat, like the repetition, that's like straight of Walt Whitman. So I think that we cannot forget that Roth is just such a talented, learned writer. I think that he read so much that it did influence his style.
Just two other words about that. First of all, there was his fluidity. I mean, he worried, and this is clear when he first started out, that he might be perceived as too fluid. He admired someone like Irwin Shaw, but he didn't want to be compared to Irwin Shaw. And so he was a profoundly experimental writer, but unlike Barth and others, he was an accessible writer. And so the schmutz that he wrote was accessible, and that made a big difference. I think one other aspect of when he emerged, and none of this, to the best of my knowledge, interested Bailey, is that he emerged at a moment, and the New Yorker published him at a moment at the same moment, or just while at the same time that they were publishing Salinger, with William Shawn recognizing that a huge part of his readership were Jews, and Jews who wanted to recognize themselves on the page, but akin to the way in which Seinfeld was Jewish, didn't want anything to be too lavishly Jewish, in much the way that Salinger was, or in the case of Roth, where his characters were identifiably Jewish, they were at the same time much like anyone else. Now, Roth didn't design his work to fit into that mode, but I think William Shawn and others recognized that his work did fit into that mode. And at a moment, and of course, he came of age at a moment before film, before visual culture dominated the creative imagination. And once visual culture started to compete with written culture, he railed against it time and time again. So I think those are additional reasons why his work ended up capturing the imagination. It was shocking, but it was also shockingly accessible, and also, as Amy says, extraordinarily poetic, and the combination of the poetic, the fluent, the accessible, and the brilliant is an extraordinary combination, explosive combination. Should we open up for discussion with those who are here in the hall who we can't see? It sounds almost like kind of religious imagery.
Yes, sure. Just a reminder, if you do have a question, you can put it into the Q&A function. Thank you all for this really rich discussion. We'll start with the inevitable question, which is, what is your opinion of the current recently published biography? So this is, I believe, the Blake Bailey biography, and it's time to address it. So take it away.
What if we go in order, Amy, Jesse, and if there's no time for me to comment, then there won't be. But what Amy, why don't you start?
I stole this line, although I agree with it. One of my friends, Miriam Jeffy Foger, said that the Bailey biography reads like an episode of Bridgerton. And by that she means, well, you probably have all seen Bridgerton, but I mean, the concern for me as a scholar of Roth, as the editor of Philip Roth Studies, is Roth has turned over the sole honorific of authorized biography to a man, Blake Bailey, who had so much access. He could have taken the life of Roth, readings of Roth in any direction. He focused on the sex and the lust and desire. And it just seems like there's so much missing. There's so much else about Roth. As Jesse said, his work with Eastern European writers, right? Or we can kind of think about his relationship with his Jewish community or his family or anything but like dirty sex with women. So that is all to say that I'm disappointed. Although he talked about the Roth Society, he talked about kind of sharing Roth's 80th birthday with him. And I felt so, there's like a moment of recognition that is, we are made a part of the official history, but now it just seems like the official history will be remembered as Roth had prostitutes and cheated on his wives. And that is unfortunate because he was so much more than that.
To the best of my knowledge, there's in terms of substantiation, only one Chinese prostitute in Soho. And yes, but Jesse.
Yeah, I read it with a kind of sinking heart because after the first 60 or so pages, it's really a disaster. He really neglects Roth's prose, Roth's writing, and
you're frozen, Jesse.
Steve, why don't you respond to the question, and if Jesse needs to log off and log on again, we can certainly wait. Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, it's undeniable that it's a work of assiduous research, and it's very difficult to compile the kind of data that Blake compiled, and that I think that has to be acknowledged. I agree with everything that Amy said, but I would go a step or two further. And I think this may have been the direction that Jesse was going to before Blake or Norton or some other force in nature froze him. What's troublesome in my mind, among the most troublesome features of the book is how it actually tracks literary achievement. Literary achievement is not to be judged by virtue of either sales, and few of Philip's books sold massively, and not to be judged on the basis of what the New York Times reviewer happened to say at one time or another. The measurement of achievement in the book is really, in a sense, the measurements used, if you will, by Wall Street. And what does it mean to produce great literature? Did he produce great literature? Was even the fact that he failed often but kept going itself an achievement? And the failures themselves are interesting. So they didn't sell. So The Breast wasn't one of his greatest books. It's actually still an extraordinarily interesting book. What was interesting about it? What makes Roth interesting are those sentences. There's no analysis of those sentences. And so those are at least the first of several dozen comments that I could make about the book. There are certainly moments in it. It seems to me it deserves to exist, and perhaps not in a literary rubble side by side with Michael Cohen's book. And there were some legal reasons, I assume, why Norton did what it did. Norton was my last publisher. It's a house that I came to see as a publishing house of great integrity. I have no inside information as to why they did what they did, but I think it's unfortunate. The book deserves to exist. One of Philip's closest friends, Marty Garbuz, a very distinguished civil rights lawyer, talked to me after the cancellation of Blake's book, and he said that he had been asked years ago to defend Albert Speer's, the publication of Albert Speer's memoir. Speer, of course, was the famous Nazi architect, and Speer's book in German was to be translated into English. And he said, if a Nazi architect can be published in the English language, so can Blake, no matter what his possible crimes might have been. So that's how I would begin to answer that very, very complicated question. Has Jesse rejoined us?
Not yet, but we'll be here for a little while
Let's
longer.
continue.
I have just not about the biographer, but about the biography itself, and something that you said earlier, Steve, which was that accessible, you called his work, his beautiful prose, accessible schmutz. And my question is, was it accessible because it was schmutz? And was this biography's attempt at putting the schmutz forward sort of like a way to honor Roth?
No, my sense is, and this I think is an idea that actually Jesse shared with me. Is that I think Blake worked very hard to make his book into a best-selling book, and he had all this access, and he spent a huge amount of time on it, and no more than some of us spend on our books too, and he wanted to make a big splash, and oddly enough, while his book on John Cheever is a very fine book, it seems to me, though Cheever is an extraordinary stylist who wrote 15, 20, 30 truly great short stories. Philip wrote 31 books, and his book about Cheever, I think, is very successful, it was the commercial success, the high visibility of the Philip Roth book that in the end ended, or seems to have ended, Blake Bailey's career. And so it's a story right out of Fitzgerald, and someone who rises enormously high and almost within moments is destroyed by the very factors that lead to his success. I've never seen anything comparable in American publishing life.
I think it's so lovely that you said twice it deserves to exist, and I agree with that. I'm thinking that Roth was so afraid to be misread or misjudged after his death that he put everything into this one authorized biography. And I agree that it deserves to exist, but we wish, I think, as readers of Roth, that Roth would have listened to his fictional voice that says things are messy, you get people wrong, purity is a lie, you can't get to the truth, and all of those add up to give someone else a try, right? So put it in the hands of somebody who might get a little messy or show Roth's character in a different light.
Philip was a rule breaker, not only as a fictional writer, but in life. And so I could say, so Blake was furious at Philip for having given such access to Claudia Roth, Pierpoint Roth, and for her book on Philip. And Philip, after he gave exclusive permission to Blake, then wrote Blake, I have a copy of the correspondence, and asked if he could show all the material that he showed to Blake to me and share it with me. Blake understandably refused, and reminded Philip that he'd signed an exclusive agreement, and that he couldn't do it. So the story that Blake tells about his being the one figure who climbed Mount Sinai in order to receive the exclusive word is not altogether accurate. And so I could at least offer that corrective. Shana, other comments, questions?
Yes. Why are Roth's humorous / satiric novels never a part of these discussions? His minor works, Outliers, The Great American Novel, never mentioned, is a hysterically funny, amazingly prescient novel.
Amy, you know a great deal about sports from your Stanford athletic child. Do you want to take a first stab at that?
I'm guilty of this. So I'm really interested in the Great American, or the American trilogy. I'm interested in kind of the heft and the weight and the serious subject matter of this American project. I'm interested in representations of death in that tetralogy. So I don't talk about these kind of minor novels, although I should. Now I have to go back to the Great American Novel for its satiric effect. I feel like it's probably very good in roasting American presidents who are unfit. But the thing that I will say is, this is kind of just an interesting anecdote from editing the journal, but we have an interview appearing between a Chinese postdoc and a scholar from the UK, David Bronner. And she asks him 3 different times, can you talk about Capes and the humorousness there? And Bronner will say, I hope you get the journal even after I'm giving this away, but Bronner will say, I'm not all that interested in Capes. I think that those are minor novels. And then 2 pages later, the Chinese scholar will say, let's talk about Capes. He's really interesting and really funny. And David will say, well, let's think about, the more major works. So this is all in the service of saying, I completely agree with you. Scholars need to look at the satirical, the earlier works maybe, and think about him less as a heavy hitter in the Great American Novel, which he certainly is, but kind of think about this playful side too.
I mean, I did actually quote from Philip's famous novel about masturbation, which is an excruciatingly funny novel, but I can speak to that question. But now we have Jesse back. Do you agree with everything that was said in your absence?
I'm so sorry I was cut off. It's probably the best thing that's happened to Blake Bailey in a long time.
So you were in the middle of speaking about Blake's
I
book.
went on for another 8 minutes without realizing the camera had cut off.
The sinking feeling, the feeling of dread is.
I think you were saying more about bats, as I recall, but why don't you try to recreate?
I was saying that I wrote 5,000 words for tablet about it. The piece sank like a stone, and probably for good reason. So we'll just take up wherever we are in the conversation now.
So, as far as the baseball novel, and I mentioned, I think The Breast is an extremely interesting novel, more interesting than people often give it credit for. I have yet to make my way through the baseball novel, but I will, I promise. And whoever asked that question, perhaps email me in a month or two. And now I'm encouraged all the more so to do it. And the Kepish novels and are, I think, in many ways inspired by his once very close, eventually estranged relationship with Albert Goldman, the once famous, eventually infamous, immensely intelligent, immensely problematic music critic. For years, I think, for the Village Voice, wrote for Life magazine, wrote incredibly controversial biographies of John Lennon and Elvis, was so hated actually among other music critics, that at the time of his death, in his 60s of a heart attack, apparently he was being flown to London for an interview, and instead of being given a first class seat, as he was promised, he was given a business class seat, and was so upset he had a heart attack and died on the spot on the plane. And I was able to confirm the story actually with just recently with a former girlfriend of his. Obituaries, and I'd never seen this in any other context, some obituaries actually stated that they were glad that he had died, and which is not what obituaries usually do. His relationship with Philip was a close one, and he was one of the sort of wild boys, at least in comparison to Philip. And Philip could gravitate toward wild boys, but at the same time didn't want to be so wild that he couldn't wake up at 8 o'clock or 7:30 in the morning and get to his desk at 9 a.m. and with a groggy feeling. So that puts a limit on one's wildness. And Kepish, I think, is a persistent preoccupation of his, and The Dying Animal, I think, is an incredibly interesting one of his best later novels. Does that give you anything to talk about, Jesse? Can you disagree or?
Well,
Okay.
Kepish's idea of a balanced life is, was it bibliography by day and dissolution by night, after Lord Byron? And I think that may have been the kind of balance that Roth aspired to. Maybe he wanted to be a bit more Kepish-like because he was so powerfully drawn to chaos, but always at a safe distance that didn't interrupt his writing.
Right. Shana?
All right, I have two questions about Roth's parents. One is a diagnostic question for you medical doctors. Did Mrs. Roth have OCD? And the other is, do you find that Roth had tenderness toward his father, as the book Patrimony shows?
Amy, you have a closer, you seem to be perhaps a more blatantly pleasant person than Jesse or me, but you have a deeper knowledge of pathology.
It doesn't take much, Amy.
Oh, I actually,
a low bar for you.
I'll give you room. I wanted to start with the father, and this has to do with Roth as a surprising or shocking writer in terms of just kind of dealing with the shit. I think you see that in Patrimony. One of the moments that seems so tender is actually like this 5-page detailed representation of cleaning his father's shit off the bathroom tiles with a toothbrush. And it's moments like that, coupled with, the masturbation moments, with Mickey Sabas urinating on his lover's grave, with all of the body stuff that Jesse was talking about, that makes him, as filthy as it seems, this most ethical writer, like separated from the biography, or we don't have to talk about his life, but in his fiction, when he writes about his father's illness, he seems so connected. He says that's the patrimony, cleaning up the shit of your father with a freaking toothbrush. So I do think that there's a level of love there in even the grossest moment, which is actually really lovely. And in terms of the mother, I've been thinking about that since Steve brought it up earlier. In Sabas theater, you have Mickey, again, this pornographic puppeteer who cannot get the ghost of his mother out of his mind. He's like looking up at the sky and he's like, wait, is that the ghost of my mother? And so I feel like that if we want to think about how Roth represents like the ghost of Bess, Sabas theater might be the place to go.
Yeah, I think Roth.
Or Exit Ghost, that extraordinary moment about dreaming about incest. But yeah, Jesse.
Oh, I think Roth underwent an evolution in how he felt about his father, from wanting to kill him when he was 21 to falling in love with him, as he says in one of his later letters. Patrimony was greeted as a kind of Valentine to his father, but I read it as a profoundly ambivalent book. If you'll recall, it ends with a nightmare. It's a nightmare of his father, this domineering, abrasive man, literally haunting Roth, coming back and in his dreams and saying, "You've done the wrong thing." So I think it captures Roth's violently conflicting feelings towards his father. As for his mother, I think there's a lot to say. As I said before, I think you see a lot of Bess Finkel in Sophie Portnoy. I mean, there really is almost a one-to-one correspondence at times between the mother character there and what we know of her. And there's a little known Roth story called His Mistress's Wife, which was published in Partisan Review, which also says a lot about mothers and possibly Roth's mother.
I wouldn't want to diagnose Bess Roth. I don't have sufficient expertise. I mean, she was immensely admired by the family. The family was enormously close. Those scenes, like the opening scene in The Counterlife, where Zuckerman is surrounded by family, is very much taken from Philip's own life. As I've mentioned in other contexts, I've discovered that the Roth family was part of what the family claimed was the largest and best organized Landsmannschaft family association in North America. They issued their own newspaper. They had their own stationery. Herman Roth was the president of the family association in 1943-44. I think Bess was the recording secretary. They had their own emblem, a kind of nobility-like seal with echoes of the flag of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. The family had come from the easternmost reaches of it in Galicia, everyone with whom I've spoken about Bess in the family have spoken about her with admiration, but have spoken about her as someone who had the cleanest house of anyone in the entire family, and the family was huge. And so the relationship between her cleanliness and what's the line between extreme cleanliness and obsessive cleanliness, and what are the cultural norms that distinguish those? I can't say. It is striking that this great master of literary schmutz comes from a kitchen that's as clean as any that existed in this vast, very well organized family. And so that I can say. I mean, Jesse's right technically when he says that Philip wanted to kill his father at the age of 21. By no means is he the only son who wants to, at the age of 21, to kill his father. And there's at least one other person like that on this panel. And so I don't know that set Philip apart. I know that he felt that Patrimony was a book that was too easy to like, that it went down a little bit like Chinese food, and he rather disparaged the positive reactions to it. So I agree with Jesse. It's in many ways a deeply ambivalent a book. Shana.
All right, we have another question back to the biography, and about the choice to turn the biography over to Blake Bailey, and whether that's not similar to turning his soul over to Claire Bloom or Maggie. What is this inborn act of sabotage?
God, I mean,
Yes.
I mean, there were differences between his relationship with Blake and Maggie and Claire. Do one of the two of you want to take a stab at that question?
Only that I agree. And I have to say, I don't know, I haven't worked this out fully, but it reads like a Greek tragedy, right? It's like Oedipus, who is so worried that the worst possible thing will unfold, that he takes actions to lead to the worst possible thing unfolding. It's uncanny.
Well, I mean, he can't be. I mean, he chooses Blake. He doesn't know about Blake's past. The story in the end is like a Greek tragedy, or I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, it's I mean, much akin to what Philip wrote about in that early speech, turned into an essay of his, that reality can't simply trumps fiction. Reality is to who would actually write this story, and imagine his biography turning out to be what it turned out to be. But so much about our contemporary lives are stranger than fiction. I mean, what fictional writer could have made up Trump? And so, but Amy, I interrupted you.
No, I think I was done.
I'm
you
sorry.
finished my sentence really well.
Roth does have the gift for self-sabotage, but I don't think it extends as far as choosing a biographer whose past life would implode spectacularly in a way that then overshadowed Roth himself.
Yeah. Blake was seemed like a very reasonable choice, and especially since he had handled John Cheever's incredibly complicated hidden life, but a life that ended up being documented in great detail in Cheever's journals, that Cheever's family gave over to Blake and then published, at least in an edited form. And Blake handled Cheever with great respect, and at the same time with honesty. And so I think that ended up being a significant reason. Blake had sold books, which I think was one of the reasons why Philip's agent preferred him, perhaps over an academic at Stanford. Philip spoke with Hermione Lee, one of the best living biographers, and she was at work at another book, and Philip was simply eager to get out this biography because of the impact of Claire Bloom's memoir. He spoke with Judith Thurman, a brilliant biographer and a very close friend of his, who probably rather wisely decided that a very close friend of Philip's should not write Philip's biography. So he did explore other possibilities. And but I think Jesse is absolutely right. No one could have predicted. I think where some of the reviewers have erred, and arguably badly, is in conflating what Blake is being charged with Philip, and I think that is an awful mistake.
Blake Bailey was so powerfully drawn his whole career to this, as it's a subjects, to disturbing men, to self-destructive men, to men with serious sexual secrets, who lived in fear of being discovered
Mhm.
We now know that was him. Roth was drawn to troubled people. And it just occurs to me that he auditioned all of these normal, well-adjusted adults as biographers, and he chose the single most troubled person to be his.
That's one of the nicest things anyone ever said to me.
And one of our guests wonders if there was how you understand him choosing a Gentile biographer, if you feel like that there's something to read into that.
I mean, Hermione Lee is half Jewish. Would that have made her more sensitive? Perhaps. And I think she would have been a brilliant choice because she is a brilliant biographer. So I mean, there is something. I think Isaiah Berlin did this in picking Michael Ignatieff, and his biographer, and he did it in part because Ignatieff was the descendant of one of the most ferocious anti-Semites in late imperial Russian life, and there was a lot of competition in that regard. And so there was a kind of irony in choosing this brilliant intellectual to write his biography. But I think perhaps Berlin chose him because he didn't quite want his Jewishness to be fully explicated. I don't know whether that's true in Philip's case or not. I think that, for all the reasons that Jesse describes, Blake was able to write with enormous sensitivity about a life that in his Cheever book, a life very altogether different from his own. But in some ways, perhaps it wasn't a life in the end altogether different from his own, in as much as so much of Cheever's life was built around disguise. And it turns out it's as it seems that so was Blake's. Philip didn't much disguise his life. And so in the end, the shidduch, this relationship might indeed have been born somewhere in the netherworld. And I don't know that Philip could have anticipated that and would have chosen him because he wasn't Jewish. A non-Jewish critic can understand the intimate nature of Jewish life. Blake Bailey did not.
Right. Well, it seems if it was deliberate, that it does fall in line with this Roth's denial of being a Jewish American writer, to find somebody who'd written about a great Gentile American writer.
He denied it, but with a wink. And he denied it because to say you're a Jewish writer means ostensibly you're a lesser writer. You're a parochial writer. But of course he recognized by virtue of his topics, and he admitted this time and time again, that he's writing persistently about Newark, and family, and Jew, the themes much akin to those of his father, who he wanted to kill at the age of 21, as Jesse said, and who he memorializes, albeit ambivalently, decades later. And so, no, I don't know that he would ever have one of his. I mean, I think Jesse was there at the ceremony, and I think writes about it. The very last item that Roth chooses in, I think, the final Library of America collection of his work, is the final item is his being given a honorary doctorate by the Jewish Theological Seminary. I mean, he loved the fact that the Jews came to embrace him, and no, he. His ambivalence in that respect didn't go all that deep.
If you read some of his early letters, he's more comfortable situating himself in the Jewish American literary tradition. Right. That's what he says to Ted Solotaroff, and he's clearly in conversation with the Jewish writers of that era, from Mailer, Salinger, Bellow, even Grace Paley, who he adored, to the commentary crowd. It's only later that he kind of disowns, in true Jewish writer fashion, the label Jewish writer. As for Blake Bailey, we have Roth on record saying that he chose Bailey because he refrained from moral judgment, and that's what Roth wanted.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble is that when you have someone on record, that's just one item in what is a complex biographical construction. So as you well know, and so it's one item probably among many. Yeah. Any final questions, Shanna?
Amy, do you have something to say? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it has to do with this idea of Roth as a great American Jewish writer. And I might even go as far as to say he was perhaps one of the last, only in the sense that things are changing now. This global universe is opening up. I mean, that's been true for the last couple of decades. But if you think about the people writing now, the great writers who come after Roth, they're thinking about kind of life on the global scale. And so I would kind of like to have a clearer sense of Roth as a Jewish writer, as maybe one of the last great Jewish writers, only in the sense that the world has changed. Writers now, American writers, are not thinking so much about what it means to be an American Jew specifically. And I think that Roth was really, sorry, I think Roth was really amazing and illuminating and kind of talented in that regard. And I don't want that part of his legacy to get lost.
I might have agreed with that statement more a half a year or a year ago. I'm not sure I would still agree with it. I think the surfacing in the last several months, not only of anti-Semitism, however that's understood, but of an intense preoccupation with Jews, and in America and elsewhere, the extraordinarily prominent role that Jews play in the perverted imagination of QAnon, and the prominence, understandable and in some ways perhaps not, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A conflict that looms enormously large in my mind, but why internationally, and any more so than the behavior of Hungary or Poland or other states. Jews do loom large, and I mean, even Van Morrison, one of my favorite musicians and songwriters, just wrote a song in his latest album that echoes the protocols of the elders of Zion. The sins, the ostensible sins of Judas continue to reverberate. That doesn't mean that there is eternal anti-Semitism, but there is this preoccupation with Jews that I don't believe is quite as dated as I might have felt a few months ago.
I was wondering when we'd get around to Van Morrison. I think the question is, what kind of rich material do American Jewish writers have to draw on there? And I think it's hard to figure that out. I mean, more recently, they've been looking elsewhere, to the past and to Israel. It was Irving Howe who famously accused Roth of having a thin personal culture. And I think it's painful to admit, but that culture has attenuated in recent decades, although there are still great writers, Nathan Englander and Dara Horn and Allegra Goodman, right, writing away and producing great work. I
mean, I think partly what Roth was able to identify in Portnoy's complaint was that in the absence of neighborhood and with the waning of faith as he understood it, all that it continued to exist was voice. And he identified that one place that only voice exists, the therapist's couch, and built that into the epicenter of that great novel. And so he too was wrestling with questions that epistemologically were not dissimilar from the ones that you're raising, Jesse. I wonder, I think there are more first-rate Jewish writers than you list, although I admire all those that you've listed. Irving Howe predicted the death of the Jewish novel decades and decades ago because he associated the last glimmers of Jewishness with the last glimmers of Yiddish culture. I think preoccupation with Jews has proved to be deeper, both fortunately and unfortunately. And so I'm not quite ready to declare this, and especially since it's been announced as almost as frequently as the Kol Nidre. So I don't know.
That's fair. I just don't want to be misunderstood. I was thinking about the imaginations of
Mhm.
Nathan Englander, for example, and Jonathan Safran Foer seem to be more in terms of the Jewish diaspora and less in
Mhm.
terms of the
Yeah.
American Jewish neighborhood like Wequahic. And I'm just worried that maybe there will be another Roth who writes a Wequahic in the way that has been imagined before, but I could be wrong.
Shana, a final question?
I don't think so. I think that we can begin
No?
to wrap this up. I want to say that thankfully there is a global preoccupation with Jews, because that's what keeps us in business here at the Toby Center for Jewish Studies and other Jewish studies departments around the world. But I think that what we've demonstrated today through this conversation is that the only way to address this complicated issue of the life or the biography of the author's work, and then the biographer of the author and that biographer's biography, is to just have these kinds of conversations. And fortunately for us, we have a writer like Philip Roth, who provides us with so much rich and beautiful story work to consider. So this is really valuable, even if we don't land on what to do next, how to read Roth moving forward. The answer is to just keep talking about it. So I'm grateful to the three of you for having this conversation and bringing us to this place where we know that we haven't answered all of the questions. If any of you want to say any final words before I stop the recording.
Thank you.
Yeah, just thank you. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Shana, for this.
Yeah, this was a real pleasure. I mean, this really was an extension of three people who enjoy talking with one another and thought others might want to listen in and talk with us as well. And it's been just a great source of pleasure for me to get to know Jesse and Amy, and people that I just deeply respect. We come from different places, and we've found that we have just so much in common, and hopefully that was amply displayed over the last hour and a half. Thank you, and Shana, thanks for moderating.
Thank you all.
Yeah.